Markets operate in cycles, and the housing market is no exception. But what's happening now is unlike the previous peaks. John Richardson, the Press Herald's Metro editor, noticed this more than a year ago. He's been with the Press Herald for 25 years, and he knew that the current rental housing crisis is very different from those in the past. The vacancy rate in the city is effectively zero, and rents have been increasing at unprecedented rates. John led a team of journalists who spent the better part of a year examining the issue. The result, a 6-part series and multimedia project called Welcome to Portland, No Vacancy, was published last month. It's one of the most ambitious pieces of journalism we've attempted, and I'm immensely proud of it. We're here today not to try to solve the problem, but to have a conversation about it. Please welcome John Richardson, who will introduce our panel and get us rolling.
We're very pleased with this turnout and happy that you're all here to be part of the discussion. Judging from the demand, I'm sure there'll be more opportunities to talk about this. Keep in mind what the panel is here for. It's a community dialogue, really. This panel has no real authority to do anything or fix anything today. And also keep in mind we can't really fix individual problems, any conflicts you might be having. Because of the market, we know that everybody's having, or a lot of people are having conflicts with landlords or tenants or neighbors or roommates. And maybe afterward, feel free to ask me or one of the panelists how to find help. If you haven't looked at the No Vacancy Project along those lines, I encourage you to do so. There's a lot of information we won't be able to get to today, but there's also resources there. Things like what are the legal rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants, how to find help. So in just a minute, I'll introduce the panelists. And then I'll go through some of the key facts that we reported as part of the No Vacancy Project. Then I'll ask some questions to get things going, and then as quickly as I can, turn it over to audience questions. Keep those, as I've asked the panel, to stay focused, and we'll try to keep the conversation moving. The same I'm asking of the audience. Keep, as much as possible, keep the questions focused and concise, and hopefully we'll get as much information as we can in the short hour that we have. All right, let me get right to the panelists, I believe. I'm going to start on my right and move right down. Grace Damon is co-chair of the Portland Tenants Union. The group supports and advocates for renters. It was first formed in 2001, but effectively went dormant before Grace stepped in and reorganized it in late 2014. That effort was her response to the fatal apartment building fire on Noyes Street in November 2014, and her sense that renters need to support and advocate for each other, especially in a market that can leave many people feeling helpless. Damon also is the founder of a nonprofit called A Space for Grace, which she describes as a community wellness center that provides affordable place for activities such as meetings, live music, classes, art, and dance. And last but not least, she is a renter in Portland, and in her words, is looking forward to an end to the current housing crisis. To Grace's right is Richard Barringer. He is a professor emeritus of community planning and development at USM, at the University of Southern Maine's Muskie School of Public Service. In fact, he was the founding director of the Muskie School in 1990. His degrees include a PhD in economics and political science from MIT. Barringer served in the administrations of 3 governors as Commissioner of Conservation and Director of State Planning, and is the author of numerous books, reports, and landmark Maine laws in the areas of land use, education, the environment, energy, economic development, and tax policy. He says he has long believed that housing is the single biggest challenge facing the city and its continuing prosperity. To Dick's right is Britt Vitalius. He is a real estate broker focused primarily on multi-unit properties in Portland. He is the founder of the Vitalius Real Estate Group, which now has 10 agents focused on the multi-unit residential and commercial market in Greater Portland. He is known for having his fingers on the pulse of the market, the rental market especially. Since 2007, he has presented a comprehensive report on the multi-unit market, in the Southern Maine at the Maine Real Estate and Development Association's annual forecast conference. And I hope we get a chance to get his forecast today. Vitalijus is serving his third term as president of the Southern Maine Landlord Association and has represented the group as a member of Portland's Housing Safety Task Force. He also is a landlord himself, owning and managing 26 units in Portland and Yarmouth. And to Britt's right is Ethan Strimling. Ethan Strimling is Portland's brand new mayor. I think his tag says mayor-elect because he was mayor-elect when we invited him to take part. It was not meant, no disrespect. In fact, this is only his third full day on the job. Before starting his new full-time post at City Hall, Ethan was the director of Learning Works, a nonprofit education and social services organization on Portland's West End that helps low-income families, immigrants, and at-risk youth. Ethan is also a former Democratic state senator from Portland and a well-known political analyst and commentator, having made regular appearances on television shows, on news shows, and in the pages of newspapers, including ours, the Press Herald and Sunday Telegram. During the campaign, Ethan set a goal of permitting 2,000 new housing units over the next 5 years. And one of his first actions after being elected was to set up a special committee to try to reverse the city's rental housing shortage. So as you can see, we got some really good panel to answer questions about the market. Before I get to that, I go over quickly, as quickly as I can, key facts that we want to start off with that we found while reporting no vacancy. Rents in Portland have risen more than 40% in the last 5 years. In a two-bedroom apartment that cost about $1,000 to rent 5 years ago is now more than $1,500 a month. That was an analysis we did in September, October. We'll find out if things have changed since then. But while incomes are, and at the same time, our rent in Portland was growing faster than in many other cities, almost all other cities across the country, according to a study that has, or numbers that Zillow released. At that point, I think it was a 17% year-over-year increase in May. At the same time, renter incomes in Portland have been falling. A renter household, the median renter household earned nearly $34,000 5 years ago, and just over $30,000 in 2014. And at an income of $30,000, a family can afford a rent of about $800 a month. That's 30% of their income. So the difference between that, $800, and the actual rent of $1,500 is the affordability gap, and it's the core of the issue. The median renter household now, if paying the average rent, is spending well over 50% of their income on rent. The reason for all of this is simply that there are more people trying to rent apartments than there are apartments to rent. And it goes beyond affordability. There has been a vacancy problem, and it tends to loosen up at this time of year and is tighter in the summer. But even if you had money this summer to rent an apartment, you likely couldn't find one. And the impact that it's having on people, again, there's a lot of information in what we reported, but we talked to middle-income families that have moved out of the city to find something affordable in Westbrook or in South Portland or in Biddeford. And we talked to people with lower incomes who can't afford to leave the city and were sleeping at the homeless shelter or sleeping in a truck parked in East Bayside or a camper parked down on Margin Way. So with that, I will get to a question which is basically an opening for the panel to give basically an opening statement, but it's a question that, given all the attention we gave to the issue, might sound like a little like a curveball, but it's a question that I've heard in the community over the recent months, and that simply is this really a problem? Is this a big problem that the city needs to adopt policies and devote money to? Or is this, as painful as it is for many people, is this just the price of progress in the city? Is this something that we have to accept, and we have to accept the bad with the good? So I think I'd like to start with Britt, if that's all right.
I think this is a big question that we think about every day, and I'm asked every day. Clearly, our city is going through a transformation right now, but I think we're also in the middle of a cycle. And so I think my answer is sort of both things are true. I think we are transforming. It's obvious to everyone that the restaurants and the energy and the money coming to the city is very different than it was 10 years ago, and it's exciting, and it's something we all love about being here. But that certainly created a pressure on the rental market that we've all experienced very strongly last spring. But I think there are cycles, and I think we're all trying to figure out, engage these cycles, and the anecdotes I've been hearing for the last 2 months in the wake of the story, which in the Press Herald's reporting, which I think was excellent, is that that's not the whole story, and landlords are out there with rentals, and they're getting 2 phone calls, and they're renting things considerably below the numbers that we were seeing in the paper, and it's not the kind of demand. And so the spring was a moment in time, now we're in a winter market, and we're gonna go through these cycles and ebb and flow.
Grace, what do you think? Is this a problem from your perspective?
I think it's a serious problem. Renters are being pushed out of the city. There's a lot of people that are making this city so great, and we don't want to see them leave. This also just is an environmental toll in the community. If we have a lot of people commuting and getting pushed out, who are we bringing in that's going to sustain our amazing culture that we have here? So people are they're dealing with overcrowding issues, unsafe living conditions, lots of problems that shouldn't be happening. We need to create some sort of solution here because doing nothing isn't going to help at all.
Dick, you spoke at a recent conference about this issue and kind of the cycles, and you've called housing a big issue for the city. So is this something that's going to correct itself, or is this a problem that has to be fixed?
I don't believe it'll correct itself. It's been clear for most of a decade that housing was looming as the biggest challenge facing the city. Successful cities, which Portland is right now, are literally people magnets. They attract especially young, energetic, creative, well-educated, aspiring, upwardly mobile people who are looking to meet one another and to learn to trust one another and to create the next economy for the city. So that cities are regenerating as a result of their attractiveness. Second, I would say that Portland's not alone in this. There's ample evidence that this is the same case across the nation in many both urban and rural places as a result of chronic stagnant wages, the impact of the Great Recession on the mortgage market, and now the economic expansion that is pushing up especially rents in desirable urban neighborhoods. And I would urge our city to do that. And I've got a few suggestions that we might make later in the program. But it's most important to understand that Maine needs Portland. Portland must address this issue and do it effectively, because Maine is driving not only Maine's economy, but Maine's demography as well. The demography may cause this boom to last longer than it might normally because of the retirement of baby boomers who like Portland and like to move and live here. And that has implications for the peninsula and the surrounding neighborhoods, which we can address later. Thank you. And I also should have said, I really want to congratulate John and the Press Herald. It's been a long time coming, but it's a remarkable series, and it's really a great blessing upon the city as a whole. And it's our job collectively to make that into the opportunity that it needs to be. I also want to congratulate our new mayor, who's going to lead the effort.
Ethan, you've called this a crisis, and if you could talk about why you think, or what your biggest fear is that this will cause in the city.
Yeah, it's a little hard to not call it a crisis when there's an affordability gap between $500 and $700 on what we earn versus what we're able to pay in rent, and when you have a 0% vacancy. And I have had some pushback, both from housing advocates and from landlords, to not call this a crisis. But when you're talking to middle-income families, low-income families who are getting squeezed out every day, it becomes clearer to you just how desperate this situation is becoming, and it's important that we recognize how serious this is. And I don't think it's just serious for those families. One of the great strengths of the city of Portland through our history for hundreds of years is the economic diversity of the people who live here. And if we start to lose that, if we start to squeeze out the middle class in a way that they can't stay, we are really going to lose something fundamental about our city that is going to leave us not recognizing what we once were, and I think leave us weaker than we could be. So I guess I don't accept the initial premise of your question, which is, is this kind of the price of progress, or is this a problem? It may be the price of progress and the problem, right? Which is kind of what you were saying. Both are true, but when the price of progress becomes a problem, you have to start to look at it and figure out what are some of the ways that we can address it. And hopefully we'll get to some of those solutions. I do want to reiterate what Dick said earlier. I think the Press-Herald doing this story was really important because a lot of people understood and felt this crisis, but you gave it some real numbers, some real data that only really people behind the scenes were understanding, and made this a public conversation in a way that I think allowed us on the council to create this committee that hopefully will have the ability and the authority to explore every possible policy choice that we could be making to see what we can do to help reverse the trend.
I'll stay right with you, Mayor. So your view is, it sounds like the city can have the good without the bad. So what are your ideas, or what are your plans? What can the city do? Will creating 2,000 housing units solve the problem?
It won't solve the problem for sure. So one of the policies that we talked about while the campaign was going on, about 10 years ago, the council put together a housing plan in which as part of the comprehensive plan, and in that had set a goal of trying to do about over 4,000 units of housing over the next 10 years. We've only permitted 2,000 over that next 10 years, leading to now. You wonder why there's a bit of a crisis, right? We did half of what we expected to do, and that number of 4,000, 4,200, I think was the exact number, was simply to maintain. And so we've done half of it, and it's left us at 0 vacancy and an affordability gap that is squeezing out too many. So what we're talking about now is how do we get back to what the council was originally calling for, which is let's get 2,000 units permitted. And let me be clear, that's not 2,000 units of affordable housing, that's just market rate, workforce, affordable, different income levels, get it all out in the community so we can begin to deal with some of the supply side, which hopefully will help on some of the demand side. But I do think some of this is on the city of Portland, and one of the things that our new city manager is working very hard at, which is very important, is making our permit process a lot easier. How many people do you talk to in the city who want to develop housing and just say, my God, I can go to Westbrook and I can do this, I can get a permit in a week or 2 days, and I go to the city of Portland, and it's going to take me 6 months. And that's just not, that's not good operational. That's not implementing the policy well, and our new city manager is very focused on this. And I think if we can loosen that up and let developers know, let folks know that they can build housing of all income levels and go through a permit process that doesn't end up crushing their bottom line, that will help.
Improved permitting process, and the 2,000 units it sounds like such a big number for Portland. Where would these units be? And I'm assuming that you're talking about development of housing off peninsula. So
It could be everywhere.
Does our transportation system, is it adequate to do that? Do we need to work on bus improvements?
Yeah, no
A
doubt
lot of people
about it.
live downtown because they have to.
Yes. Councilor Suslovic would get very mad at me if I didn't bring up something about public transportation, as he's on the Metro board. So, yes, no doubt about it, our transportation system, it has to be both on peninsula and off peninsula. It's got to be in every council district. And we're talking about all around the city. And I don't think 2,000, I think 2,000 units is a minimum. And I think we'll get there. We're already starting to see things start to move. We need to make sure that there's a diversity of what's moving, so it's not all simply luxury, but we are starting to see more stuff get on the market. You saw the article in the paper today. There's more stuff that we are aware of that's coming down the pike. There's the Federated project. So there's hundreds of units that are already in the pipeline. We just need to smooth that out.
Okay, we'll just work back toward me. So Britt, is the market going to take care of this on its own?
I think we're in a city that hasn't had population growth since I was a kid here. I mean, that's my understanding. We've been around 65,000, and maybe we're creeping towards 70, but this is not a booming town from a population perspective. There has not been market rate new apartments built in the city on the peninsula until the recent project last year at West End Place. And now there are about 700 units in the pipeline. That's a big change from having no market rate units the last 30 years, as far as I understand, and now there's about 700. So I guess the point I want to make sure that's on the table here is things are starting to happen, and I think we absolutely need to deal with the issue, but not overreact, because right now, the city, from another perspective, if the Press Herald had done the story as, what was the condition of housing in the city of Portland 15 years ago, everybody in this room would have been horrified. The city, this housing stock in Portland is old, and it's not in good shape, and it wasn't being taken care of. It wasn't being taken care of because you didn't need to. There were lower income renters, and the rents did not support making improvements to these old buildings with no insulation, steam system, and rickety windows. And today, that's not what we're seeing. We've got a housing stock that's improving greatly, and I think the fire department's been very happy at the compliance they've seen with their new inspections in the wake of the Noy Street fire, because landlords are willing to make the improvements and have the ability to make the improvements to these buildings. They're not just taking all the money home. So I think we need to deal with the housing and make sure people have a place to live, but not overbuild and drive rents down in a way that suddenly we've got vacant buildings and a vacancy rate where these buildings start to become neglected again.
So the overreaction that you're concerned about is overbuilding.
Yeah, there's only 17,000 units in the city of Portland, so 2,000 new units may be the right number, but that's a 12% increase in our total stock. That's a big change. Now, I'm not an expert and I don't analyze, numbers of units, but I think we need to be aware, not just. I also think this problem should be looked at from a community perspective. We all tend to be very Portland-based. I'm very Portland-based and very peninsula-based. In most big cities, things become very dense and very expensive downtown, whether it's Boston or Manhattan or San Francisco or anywhere, and you wind up having some diversity and excitement push out into surrounding communities. And as a broker, I can still barely give away a multi-unit in Westbrook, even though it's only 5 miles down the road. I think there are a lot of communities here that could share in this whole housing issue, and it's not just a Portland Peninsula problem. And so we should be broadening the discussion.
That's interesting. And Dick, you had some ideas on how to address this.
Well, at the risk of,
Just grab the microphone, pull it right over. Thanks.
at the risk of alienating most everybody in the room, I'd like to use Boston as an example, if I might. Let me just talk very quickly about the way Boston grew over a 100-year period between the 1840s and World War II. Boston, like Portland, is a peninsula, and they found out very quickly when the Industrial Revolution came that they didn't have enough room, they needed more housing. So what did they do? They filled in Back Bay and did private housing, and then they filled in the Fenway and they did private housing. And then they ran up against Brookline, and Brookline refused to let them do it, and they still do. But they then started doing things like just absorbing surrounding jurisdictions. Charlestown, Brighton, Allston, East Boston, just with the consent of the voters. This was in the time of municipal consolidation around the turn of the century. They became part of Boston, and they in Boston started having development policies that encouraged the development of those communities themselves. And then they ran out of those because most people forget Boston was a huge manufacturing center and needed lots and lots of immigrant labor. My best friend's mother was a sewer who worked out in Huntington Avenue in those factories producing dresses and pants and suits and so on. And the city was full of people like that. The city then put in public transportation that connected the downtown out to Roslindale and West Roxbury, Hyde Park, Dedham, all outlined what in those days were suburbs, and built village centers at those transportation nodes. And I would advise the city to think in those terms. I really would. I mean, just imagine if we could think in terms of 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, 6 million, 7 million, 8 million, 9 million, 10 million, 11 million, 12 million, 13 million, 14 million, 15 million, 16 million, 17 million, 18 million, 19 million, 20 million, 21 million, 22 million, 23 million, 24 million, 25 million, 26 million, 27 million, 28 million, 29 million, 30 million, 31 million, 32 million, 33 million, 34 million, 35 million, 36 million, 37 million, 38 million, 39 million, 40 million, 41 million, 42 million, 43 million, 44 million, 45 million, 46 million, 47 million, 48 million, 49 million, 50 million, 51 million, 52 million, 53 million, 54 million, 55 million, 56 million, 57 million, 58 million, 59 million, 60 million, 61 milli village centers out there along Brighton Avenue, Washington, Forest Avenue, Stevens Avenue, connected into the city by really good public transportation. That's really essential. So I would say to start thinking off the peninsula, although on the peninsula are things we can do too. Anytime somebody puts up a single-story building on the peninsula, they're wasting space. And it's going on right as we speak. Okay, so I would say nothing goes up on the peninsula that's less than 2.5 stories. And along the important semi-highways, Forest Avenue, Marginal Way, Franklin Street, Spring Street, nothing less than 4 to 5 stories. Nothing. We have to increase density. So production and density are the keys to solving this issue, I think. And 2,000 housing units over a decade is possible. We're already doing a couple of hundred a year. I think we need to double that in order to meet the projected demand that the Portland Chamber at least sees coming down the road. I would recommend to you all a recent study by the Portland Community Chamber called The Housing Challenge, which is really, it addresses, I think, erroneously affordable housing, but it's very, very good on presenting the entire picture of the housing situation in Portland and the production problem, which is really essential. Finally, I really think that this is going to take extraordinary leadership, and we've got to get by the kind of neighborhood parochialism that we've faced in this city, truly. I mean, Munjo Hill is a great place. I lived there for 20 years. My wife and I sold our place 2 years ago, and there are now 2 families living in it, where we used to live. And we've moved into a smaller place because of our age, and we no longer have the need for the space we did. But 2 families living there, and that's exactly what new housing does, always. Every time a new housing opportunity comes up, at least 2 and sometimes even 3 families benefit as a result just by moving up, which is the way people get ahead in this society. So I think attitudes, public attitudes in this are going to have to change in order for us to meet the challenge.
And Grace, how would you like to see the city fix this, and what do you think renters are looking for from the city?
Well, I think right now the problem is timing. I mean, we have all of these places that are being built with high-income housing, which is raising rent in the surrounding areas, and that's pushing out renters now. So I think what we need to deal with is the homelessness issue and getting people housing now that need it, that live in the city and create such a great place. So I think that I understand nothing can happen overnight, but we really need to push our timing with this and get rapid results. So there needs to be decisive action and some policy changes that happen quickly.
So you're concerned because a lot of the new housing that's coming online is pretty high rent. To be honest, it's luxury. It's well above what the median renter household can afford and above what the market rents are. The city did just recently adopt rules that would require some of the new housing to be affordable to people with middle incomes. That's still above what a median renter income would be, but so a one-bedroom under that policy might be put on the market at $1,300, a maximum of $1,300. And that's a policy called inclusionary zoning, and the idea is to make some of the new units affordable to middle-income people, which would eventually create space in the marketplace for lower-income people. But were you satisfied with that? Do you think that was aggressive enough?
No, I think that right now there's the problem with the zoning that's going on and finding this inclusionary zoning is they might have a percentage of these new places that allow for low-income residents to live there. However, the guidelines for that are either you have to be in this small bracket, so it's either high income or very low income, but the median income is kind of, I think that you're a little bit off in pricing for saying that $1,300 is affordable for the average worker in Portland, because there's nothing that's happening with income that is it's basically just a skewed market.
That it would have the opposite effect, would backfire. How do you feel about the policy? Is it aggressive enough or too aggressive?
It's sort of history at this point. I mean, I don't think it's actually that big a deal either way. I think it's 100% of
Yeah.
median income,
Okay.
so I don't think you're
Let me ask you
handicapping the
this way.
developers.
Why is it all or not all, but many of the new units coming on are pretty high rent?
Yeah.
$1,800 for a one-bedroom. Why is that happening? Is that necessary?
The cost to develop property, you can only develop property if you can get a certain level of income in. We've got a piece of land on the market right now that seems reasonably priced, and we sort of run some pro formas, and I haven't done development in my career as a broker or even been familiar with it because there hasn't been any in the city until just recently, so I'm sort of learning some about this. And you start to do out the numbers and you realize, I tried to map it out as look, let's just put a middle income development there, $1,100, $1,200 for 2-bedroom units, something, heat included, and you can't build it and pay for it. You've got to get tax credits, you've got to be able to get some help somewhere else to make that work. It's just how the numbers work. And no one's trying to come in and just gouge the renters, but if you want a new building, you've got to be able to pay for it. Unless you can get creative and use some other programs. And some people are doing that. I mean, that's why Avesta and CHOM and some of these groups have been very successful and good at what they've done for a lot of years.
Right, but it's,
Can I just jump in on the rental price before people totally freak out? I think your study in the paper was outstanding. The 1560 or whatever number, I believe that I read that was the listed asking price on Craigslist. That is not the average 2-bedroom rent price. I don't know exactly what the average 2-bedroom rent price is, I'll tell you. I don't think anybody does. I think what's happening in the city is the rental market is starting to stratify. So there's now getting to be a Class A, B, and C rent the way we'd have in an office space or others. We didn't really have that in the past, so it's even hard to say an average rent. But I can tell you, I've know units, and I know people who are renting 1-bedrooms on Munjoy Hill on the Prom for $960, and they got 2 phone calls. The lowest they've had in the last 12 years. Another 2-bedroom on Munjoy Hill, heat included, parking for $1,375, and they got 2 phone calls, finally got it rented.
In
So,
recent,
like the last
several-
2 weeks.
Last 2 weeks.
I'm definitely hearing landlords saying, this is not our experience right now in time, and it's winter and all that, but
Well, I do definitely want to get to your forecast at some point, but Grace, you wanted to?
oh, I just think that, I understand it's hard to compensate for the high cost that it means to construct a building for tenants, but at the same time, I mean, it's constructing those buildings that also raises rent in the surrounding areas, which isn't necessary because there's not a lot of upgrades that are happening to these buildings in order to compensate for the high boost in rental costs. So it's not necessarily the construction that's the problem, it's just how it's affecting the surrounding areas. And everybody is getting a boost in, like, for instance, I was talking to someone who had a $400 increase in rent over a 4-month period. It's just insane. It's going way out of bounds, and it needs to be stopped. There needs to be some sort of rent control of some sort to stop this flux.
Jump in there for a second. So we've heard the same thing, that landlords have told tenants that your rent is going to go up several $100s. And as far as I know, there's no legal protection against that. We've also heard where tenants have been given the 30-day notice of eviction if a building has been sold to be renovated or something. So do you feel like tenants have enough protection legally in this kind of a market? It sounds like you mentioned rent control. I don't know if that's something that you're actually looking for. But what are the legal protections you think tenants need right now they don't have?
Yeah, I definitely think that rent control could be a short-term solution to the issue. And I think personally there needs to be, well, the tenants need an advocate at City Hall. So there shouldn't just be, you know, a low income, sorry.
Housing safety office now?
A housing safety office, but there should be a specific tenant advocate that helps with all of these problems that tenants are facing, because right now, they hardly have anywhere to turn. There's no affordable lawyers, and you have to meet special income requirements to do low income, to have a low income lawyer, you know. And so right now, there's no one that's standing up for tenants at City Hall in these issues.
I could go back to Britt, but I'm going to jump to Ethan on that. Ethan, do you think there's a need for somebody specifically at City Hall to advocate for tenants? And, I mean, what do you think of rent control?
I think, well, let me just, I think the idea of a tenant advocate is actually a great idea, and we ought to take a look at it, and maybe we'll take a look at it as the council. And, you know, again, this housing committee's job is going to be to look at all these ideas, to not throw anything out right off the bat, and to say, to look at whatever policies people want to put on the table, and their responsibility will be to explore those and to see how they might work or how they might fit, what's going on in other communities. So I don't want to rule anything in or anything out at the beginning. I think what's important is that we move away from anecdotal evidence, right? That we move towards, which was what the Press Herald's story was so useful. And the little pushback I would give is, you know, I get it that some landlords are saying that they're not getting a lot of calls, but that's very anecdotal, when what we know is that the data says there's an affordability gap of over $500. Now, that's based on a study. We can look at that a little more deeply, and maybe that's not the actual rent, but I'm sure it's not $500 lower than what the actual average rent is. So if we know there's 0% vacancy and a $500 affordability gap, we need to talk about that and not try to pretend that it doesn't exist. Not that that's what you're saying, but there are cycles, and we're going to go through those cycles. So we need to be looking at all pieces we can.
I want to give Britt a chance on, in the rent numbers, and what Britt's talking about, the 40% increase was in the advertised price on Craigslist and in the newspaper. So that's kind of the leading edge of the market. These are apartments that are going on the market, and people are going to ask basically what the market can bear. Those aren't necessarily what landlords are charging tenants, especially long-term tenants. So, and what we're hearing are the difficult cases, but are you, you work with landlords. Are all landlords raising rents, you know, $100, $200 a year at this point? What are the landlords who have long-term tenants? Are they doing it?
I think that the thing that's really hard to capture about the market is all the tenants who aren't moving around. So even when I do my annual study and I say, you know, what are you getting for rents, or sort of the rents in place, but then there's the new rents they go out and get. Most landlords have the philosophy that if you've got a good tenant, you really don't alter that too much. You may do some marginal increases, but the first rule for any reasonable landlord is don't lose a good tenant. Work it out, make sure they can afford it. So I think those are hard numbers to capture. So there are some bigger landlords that I try and survey. They've got some good numbers, and I'll have some averages as we get into January on those. I don't have them today, but I think the rental market has been going up consistently in Portland. I've pegged it about 5% a year for years, and it's probably around that. I think this last year maybe was closer to 8%. 17% got out there because of Zillow or whatever, and no one knows what that was based on. They were probably looking at the listed price, because you get a couple new properties with some high rents, and they're sitting out there on Craigslist. Those are going to factor in. All the units that are not turning over are not on Craigslist. Those are still the average rents in the market. So it's not 17%. That was not the increase. It's probably 10 or under. We don't know exactly. There may not be a single answer, but.
I've got to get to the audience quickly. I wanted to ask, though, about the short-term rentals issue. There are over 200 Portland listings now on Airbnb, which is one of the sites where you can rent apartments or homes or rooms by the night or by the week. And it's clear that some property owners have stopped renting apartments year-round in order to make more money renting by the day or by the week. The city's looking at it and is concerned about it, but it's really unknown how big of an impact this is having on the shortage, basically, or on the inventory. Ethan, do you think that's a big issue? Is it a big factor in the shortage that people felt this year?
Well, 200 units is not a big factor. It depends on how you define big. It's certainly a real factor, and it's something we have to monitor. I think there's two issues around it. One is how often is this happening? How many, if that grows to 400 to 1,000 to 2,000 units, then you're talking about a very big factor. And the other is a fairness factor, right? Which is that there are also hotels here, short-term, that they have to pay certain fees and they have to live under certain rules and regulations, and Airbnb does not. So we need to look at that fairness on how that works to make sure that we're, charging the same and having the same level of inspection and safety. One issue I want to come back to, the inclusionary zoning that you talked about just real quick. One of the most important parts of the inclusionary zoning, I think almost more important than the 10%, is one thing we desperately need is a robust housing trust fund, and we don't have that. And people can buy out of these additional units, because you're right, I mean, it's 120, for a family of four, you're talking about $90,000 a year. That's the kind of unit you're talking about that somebody has to make affordable. So $300,000, $325,000 a year to buy for a condo, for instance. But they can buy out of that requirement for $100,000 and help build the trust fund. And to give you some context, the trust fund to buy out in Boston is $350,000 or something.
You better explain that. So the inclusionary zoning ordinance will create a new fund, right? Or is it already?
There's a fund, there's a housing trust fund that basically, if you take a unit off the market right now, you have to pay into this housing trust fund. You're now going to have to pay into the housing trust. If you build 10 units of housing, the inclusionary zoning says one of them has to be workforce housing, which means up to 120% of poverty. You can buy out of that requirement and allow that unit to charge whatever you want for $100,000. And that money goes into the housing trust fund. And that money then allows us to be able to do and invest in whatever kind of housing is most needed. And that's probably the most important part of the inclusionary zoning, because I've spoken to a couple of developers already this week, and they're looking to develop housing, and they said, yeah, we're just going to buy out. We're going to put the $100,000 per unit, whatever it is, 2 or 3 units, depending on the size of their building, and that's a few $100,000. If we can build that trust fund, that will help us tremendously to keep a more diverse market.
Taking too long, so I got to get to audience questions. If you just raise your hand, I'll try to get to as many as I can. Oh,
Sorry.
just after this, sir.
Just one more thing. I just wanted to say that also tenants aren't really safe in their current housing situations either because of the rising market. So they're also, because there's an abundance of people looking to move in, landlords feel okay with raising up rents for even good tenants that are staying in this situation. So not everyone's safe. But I also wanted to say, if you support tenants' rights and you're a tenant in Portland, please come to our meeting on January 10th from 3 to 5 p.m. It is at A Space for Grace, which is above Enterprise on One Marginal Way. So I hope that we get some more tenants to support us. Thank you.
There's a gentleman standing next to the post over there who.
Robert Wood, landlord, small fry, 50 units. One of the things that I hope you can do in the future is to incorporate in your data. One of the things I hope you can do in the future is to incorporate in the data of rents. What is included? You just say an average rent, but if you have to pay heat and hot water, for example, that's going to be another $150 a month. So when you throw out the figure of what's the average rent in Portland, you really are missing the potential for accuracy in getting whether it's a heat and hot water included or whether it's no utilities included.
It's a great point. $1,560, which was the average that we found on the market, September, for a 2-bedroom, included heat and hot water. And we factored in that $140 to $150 if it wasn't in. So we tried to equalize. But yes, you're right. I should have said that. Right here in the third row back.
I think a big issue that hasn't been discussed here today is how to prevent our market from being taken over by corporations such as Port Property Management, because how are you going to prevent prices from skyrocketing if a corporation has control of the entire market? I mean, that's exactly what's happening.
I'll let the panel, I'll kick that around, but Port Property is obviously large. On one hand, it's a corporation. On the other hand, it provides housing. I think they have hundreds and hundreds of units. So, Britt, you want to address that? It's a fact that there are corporations that own a large portion of Portland's housing?
So I don't know if corporation means good or bad. I don't believe Port Properties is a corporation. I believe it's locally owned, and in fact, I think the primary owner lives on the West End, and most of its employees live here and work here. They're getting big. I think they're up to about 1,000 units. There are other landlords that have 200, 300, and 400 units.
Is there an issue about concentration of ownership?
I think that's a bigger question. I don't know that they've taken over the city and have a monopoly on rents. I think they're smart about what they do, and they're going in and they're buying buildings that are tired and need some work, and they're going in and improving the buildings. And when they're doing that, they're displacing the tenants and they're refilling them. I think they've found a need in the market there. I don't think they can do that forever, but they're certainly improving the housing stock along the way. I think they're just responding to what's happening in the market and the issues we're discussing. I don't know that they're doing anything better or worse than anyone else.
Anybody else want to address the issue of corporate ownership? I'm sorry, all the way in the back, and make Stephanie run back to the woman in the red jacket.
Hi, thanks. I'm so glad we're having this. My name is Diane Russell. I'm the state representative for Munjoy Hill in downtown Portland. So I was delighted to hear Munjoy Hill mentioned numerous times. I can't tell you how many people I have run across. I literally took a cab to get here so that I could be here from work. And the cab driver was like, oh yeah, I lived on the East End and just had to move to Scarborough. I went to Walmart last night. And the greeter was one of my people who I had watched grow up on Munjoy Hill. Oh, yeah, we had to move to Scarborough. I had to move to South Portland. I had to move to South Portland. I had to move to Westbrook. I appreciate the mayor's comments about this getting beyond the anecdote, because all I'm hearing from people left and right is that they can't afford to live there. And I'm the state representative for that district. I am barely able to afford to live in the district that I represent. I do not know how, I'm termed out, and I don't know how we're going to have somebody from Munjoy Hill who can actually represent the working class, because it's so difficult to have someone to be able to afford to live there. So I don't have any additions to add, but I just wanted to make it clear that this is so important, and I really appreciate that the mayor is taking a leadership role on this, and the Press Herald as well. And I just wanted to thank you, because it's going to be very difficult for me to stay on the Hill, and that's my neighborhood that I love, and all my people are there, and I'd like to be able to stay there. So whatever we can do to fix this, I really appreciate your help on it.
It's all up front. Yeah, it's all up front, right here. I was looking for somebody in the back.
So William Higgins, Homeless Voices for Justice. We need to protect the people whose properties have been purchased. They need greater than a 30-day notice. We need to hold the new owners to whatever the lease terms for the period those leases are valid. We need to. Too many people are being displaced in this city, and sure, the new owners want to rehab the buildings, but you have to give the time to the people to find adequate housing if they need to move. Thank you.
Thank you. Ethan, is that part of the discussion, the 30-day eviction notice that's come up several times? And I think the tenants union has called for a 90-day.
Yeah, it certainly should be. I was just asking about it because I knew, just so you know, in order to increase your rent, they have to give 45 days notice. It's a little backwards. They have to give 45 days notice to increase your rent, but only 30 days to evict. So that doesn't quite work. So I do think we probably have to take a look at that and try to figure it out. That's the kind of issue where we can begin to put some protections in place. But of course, those are really Band-Aids to the bigger problem, which is that the rents keep going up. And if somebody gets 45 days notice to be evicted and there's nowhere for you to go, that's not really going to make much difference over 30 days. So we need to make sure there's places for you to go. But in those moments where landlords are adjusting the rent, we ought to make sure that we give adequate notice so that tenants can understand their options.
Thank you.
Hugh Nazer, I've been a landlord and, for 25 years, and I've been in land use planning for 30. We've heard tonight that the apartments are unaffordable and buying a new unit's unaffordable. We've also heard that there's a virtually 0% occupancy vacancy. The two are incompatible. I mean, obviously, the supply and demand are such that the apartments are full. They're not full of the kind of people who would like to live here. They're full of the kind of people who can afford to live here. Now, we've talked about cycles. The trend line is up. The cycles go up and down on the trend line, but the trend line is clearly up at a fairly steep rate. The cost of housing per square foot has been discussed, and it's very hard to imagine a $1,000 efficiency unit of 900 square feet being affordable given the land prices on the Hill and on the peninsula as a whole. So the only solution is to increase supply, and I think Dick mentioned the only way that lower cost supply is going to be made available. The way it was along every trolley line that was built out of every East Coast and Midwestern city back during the period that Dick was talking about. Not only the subways, but the trolleys. Any good transportation can increase supply along those major routes. And that's really what has to be looked at, I think. If you can get to the transportation issue, the rest can follow more easily.
We're going to run out of time for questions, but Dick Barringer, I wanted to ask you that question. So the idea of creating villages in what are the suburban neighborhoods of Portland has been discussed. And the suburban neighborhoods of Portland are where typically you run into political resistance to density or development, right? So how do you get past that, or how did Boston address that problem? And as quickly as you can, because I'm going to try and get to two more
And I want to know how we annex Falmouth. Is that what you were saying? Boston getting a little bigger? Or?
You have to give them the vote and it won't work. Yeah. Well, this is what I meant by changing attitudes. That there is no alternative. If you want affordable housing, you've got to get more housing, period. Production is the key to that. And the key to production, both in terms of its cost and in terms of the number of units, is density. I'm not talking about building 40-story towers out there on Stevens Avenue, but there's no reason that one can't think in terms of 4 to 5-story buildings that will have commerce on the bottom and apartments above and so on. The way all the streets in every good city in this country, thriving city in this country, are lined. And there is real resistance to density, not just here in Portland, but all across Maine. It seems to be a dirty word. I grew up in Charlestown, where, of all things, it's a mile square and it had 27,000 people when I was a kid. And it had 27,000 people because it was largely 3-deckers. And it had beautiful parks designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, a great high school, great public libraries, and it was a joy to live there and to grow up there. So I'm kind of accustomed to it. But the main mentality is that, unless I can see the horizon and be somewhere near the water, it's not going to go. But honestly, look at how attractive Congress Street is as a place to be, to walk, and even to live. And we can do that in other nodes around the city, but they've got to be connected by public transit. There's just no way that you can say, okay, we're going to put more people out there and they're going to use their cars to come in. The two are related and go together. It is a big change in attitude here.
Mayor Stringley.
Yeah, I know we have to wrap up. 2 things real quick. I do want to note that the Housing Committee, a number of those members are here. Councilor Belinda Ray, Councilor David Brennerman, Councilor Nick Mavadonis. I saw Councilor Spencer Thibodeau out back as well. So please feel free to reach out to them. Jill Doosan is going to be the chair, so please feel free to reach out to them directly if you need to. And in what you were just talking about, I just want to quote an Ed Suslovic quote again, which I think really describes it very well. The only thing we seem to hate more than sprawl is density. And obviously, we got to make a choice. And so that to me is the crux of the problem. This issue around density really is key, and we have to figure out how to balance it, because I think everybody understands we don't want a 100-story building right on our coastline as well, but there is a balance. So.
I think a question that's out there that it was sort of implicit in some of the comments, and I think this is just a question philosophically, is, does everyone get to live on Munjoy Hill? Things are changing. I don't get to live on Falmouth Foreside on the water. I can't afford it. And I think that's sort of an undercurrent that we have to wrestle with as we go through this change.
Great question.
Paula Gerstenblatt. I'm a professor at USM. Hi, Dick. In the School of Social Work. And one of the things that strikes me about zoning laws, and I'm going off the peninsula here, I'm going off the grid, is that they really were designed for suburban sprawl. And when we look at the other Portland, Oregon, and think about density, it's not just about building 5-story buildings. It's encouraging people with existing property, like I have off of Brighton near USM, where I could build a unit above my garage, and what the zoning, how to deal with zoning and freeing things up so that when we create density in new units, it's not just developers that are doing that, that there's a lot of opportunity to increase units without increasing huge sprawl and size. So I think that zoning in terms of the city, we have to look at zoning laws that are very outdated, and a company like we have to look at that they're suburban, they're looking at land use that's very different than what we have right now. And then just an FYI off subject, when you look at the vacancy issues and eviction and new purchase and moving tenants out, look at California and look at the Ellis Act. There are other precedents around this to deal with people who stand to profit greatly by removing residents from existing renters and property.
Hi, I'm Chris Kessler. I live in South Portland, actually, and this problem is, just as huge of a deal across the bridge. And I just wanted to reassure the public a little bit in that South Portland, as a municipality, is also looking at this issue, and people in the community over there are looking to, solve this issue for the region. But one of the most immediate problems we have are, people, families being displaced in very short periods of time. And, we had murmured rent control and as a possible solution. And you say that there's a committee working on this right now, but are there any deadlines to coming up with a solution?
Along with that is, you do see that South Portland rental market is basically become an extension of Portland. Is there any coordination at all? So the deadline and the coordination?
I hope there will be coordination for sure, and the committee has not met yet. The council is going to be doing some work in the next month in terms of trying to set goals for committees and parameters and how we'll do our work. But we are certainly looking for as tight a timeline as possible, but we want to make sure the committee does good work, and we want to make sure things aren't rushed and that they look at both long and short-term solutions. We want to not just react to the moment, but look down the road. So, but my understanding in working with and talking to Jill Dewson, the chair, she's very interested in trying to move something through that committee within 6 months so that we can try to get something and get some good ideas and policies debated.
I would just add to what the mayor has said. Portland has a housing element in its comprehensive plan that was drafted in, I believe, 2002, and its goals are just terrific. I mean, I wouldn't change a word of the goals. So the goals, I think, are already established, and they address all the issues we've been talking about today. The problem is the strategy is outdated. The times have changed, and we really need to think anew and come up with some new ideas. For example, there's now such a thing as a housing TIF, which is in about the same status as the economic development housing TIF was in the 1980s. And there are really creative applications that could be made of that housing TIF that could add to the housing trust fund and really change much of the development scenario in the city. So I strongly recommend that to the members of the council, in addition to regionalism.
All right, we're just about out. I want to give the panel one last chance to say something if they really wanted to, and I'll just pose it as a question, and the answers are going to have to be quick. It's 1 o'clock. But what is your biggest fear about this market, and what's your biggest hope? Probably should have given you some time to think about that first. I'll start with Grace. What are you most afraid of, and what do you hope happens?
I'm just most afraid that things are going to continue the way that they have been and continue to get worse. And like I said before, the people that are creating this really amazing culture in Portland are just going to be pushed out and replaced with only people that can afford it, and that's just too bad. And I hope that the city will really get some deadlines together and create some really solid plans for changing the way that things are right now. And I was just going to mention, maybe changing some zoning codes so that in the lowest density parts of the cities, we are actually creating more housing versus doing it in parts of the city that might not or would allow for the low-income neighborhoods to get their rents raised. So I think that there's an alternative way to do it. But thank you so much.
I hope I won't offend Grace, but speaking as an economist, the answer to the whole issue of affordability is one of supply. And I'd like you to take away from today the two issues of production of new housing and density. Those are what really matter. Thirdly, I would just offer that Paula Gerstenblatt mentioned her house on Brighton. I have a son who with his wife now have 2 children. They live in Deering, and they are living in a really tiny house in Deering. It was built during World War II to really substandard construction. And it took them, they decided to tear it down and put up a new house on exactly the same property. No change in the footprint. It took them longer to get the permits in Deering than it did to build a new house. Just amazed me, really. He kept saying to me, "You must have friends in City Hall, don't you?"
Honestly, I don't think there's too much I'm really concerned about. I think, and it's not because there's not an issue. It's because I think we've got some new houses coming online. We've got some new units coming online. I don't think that's going to solve the problem, but it's going to be a start. And development's slow, but it's coming. I think we've got a good city council, and I think we've got a new mayor. And I think as long as we have discussions like this and contemplate these issues in a thoughtful way that is not overly agenda-driven in any one direction, but really tries to embrace what we want this city to be about, then I think I'm mostly hopeful, because I think we're in an amazing city. That's why we're all here. I think we're lucky to be here, lucky to live in Portland, and it's an exciting time, and change is always challenging. But I think we're embracing it, we're thinking about it, and trying to do it in a slow and thoughtful way, and I think we're going to love the Portland of the future as much as we love the Portland today.
Thank you for having this forum. I think this is really important, and it certainly gives me great hope on where we're going, that people are coming together and that this many folks came out and recognized the importance of this issue. My fear, somebody asked me at the inauguration on Monday what I liked best about sort of the moment, and what I liked best about the moment on Monday is we had a celebration at Ocean Gateway, and it was remarkably diverse, and people from all over the city, from all different ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds were in the room, and I was very proud of that because it really felt like Portland. And so the fear is that that won't exist if we don't take action. But I'm hopeful because I feel like we understand this is now something we have to address, and that I'm hopeful that we will create policies that are both short-term and long-term to really address the issue and keep the quality and character of this city as strong as it's ever been.
Great. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the panel.